Venerable Chodron reminds us regularly about how much creative writing, storytelling, and exaggerating we do in our heads when we encounter situations. The problem is that we assume that the story we've made up is the truth, when actually it's just a story, an interpretation or an explanation that we've made up. And our stories often lead to a lot of unnecessary suffering. There's so many different causes that shape how we experience any situation, including assumptions based on what we perceive through our senses, from our habits, memories, previous experiences, our opinions, biases, prejudices, not to mention our karmic predispositions. Other causes include information coming into our senses, what we see or what we think we see, what we hear, smell, taste, touch, those sorts of things. Some of our thoughts are accurate, but many of them aren't, because they're based, the information is heavily influenced by our previous experiences, as well as the emotions that we might be experiencing that day. So we may start assuming that we know another person's motivation. You ever done that? And assuming that our ideas and opinions are reality, even though we aren't anywhere near being clairvoyant, at least I'm not. Venerable calls this mind reading, and assuming another's a motivation, I think 100% gets us into trouble. In the nonviolent communication training, there's a really simple tool that, when applied, helps us to explore just how distorted many of our thoughts and perceptions are. And it's quite helpful. It begins with describing the situation accurately, or trying to see what would a camera have seen in that situation. So it sounds so simple, but describing a situation accurately is much harder than it sounds, because what appears from our side to be an objective description, or what we think is an objective description, often turns out to be a lot of interpretation or storytelling, or exaggeration. It has little to do with what's actually going on. And I'll bet all of us could come up with countless examples. This may seem like a silly example, but I'll bet each one of us can relate to it, and brings this point home. Each morning in the meditation hall, we sit quietly for 5 minutes and calm and focus our minds, and then we stand up and we look across the room and we bow to each other before we bow to the Buddhas. And as I look around the circle, if I'm in a good mood, I don't put much emphasis on whether a person looks grumpy or not, or whether a person looks away quickly or not, or whether a person takes their time in acknowledging that I'm waiting for them to look at me. But if I'm in an afflicted mood that morning, I can certainly take personally the grumpy look or the glance away, because I start interpreting that it has meaning for me. You know, I might think that person meant to ignore me, so I'm assigning motivation. Or that they're still angry because of what happened yesterday. Or that person's trying to hurt me by quickly looking away. Or that person's not respecting me, they're looking down at me. You probably don't have those thoughts, do you? Or that person's judging me. Or that person doesn't appreciate me. I mean, I could go on and on, right? So probably you can hear the loaded words in that description that reveal, in those moments, the interpretation, the exaggeration of what's happening, and the assumptions that we make about another person's motivation. And we can get so worked up about what we think has happened that it can be difficult to hear anybody else's interpretation or explanation of what happened. So this approach from nonviolent communication of describing just the bare facts of the situation, much like what a camera would record, I find so helpful in cutting projections and assumptions and bringing me back to being curious about, I wonder what's really going on. I wonder what's happening for that person. I wonder what they're thinking. Wonder what's going on for them. And so then, instead of all this creative writing, the story comes down to, I looked across the room, I made eye contact with Venerable so-and-so, and we bowed to each other. Period. No elaboration, no creativity there, no proliferation. So tracking our interpretations helps us to differentiate between what actually happened and all the stories and layers of meaning that we apply to any given event. And if we don't track that process of how we layer interpretations, chances are good that we'll believe our erroneous stories and then react with afflictions and then go from there, unskillful actions. So I have found this practice to be very helpful. I've tried to apply it. This morning I was mulling over a situation that recently happened, and when I shared it with someone, I was actually using all the right words. I was saying, I'm interpreting the situation this way, and it's pushing my button. I didn't realize that I was still assuming that my interpretation was correct, or that my button should never be pushed. So there are layers and layers of working with these tools to help us to begin to see our own reactivity. In fact, I should have been very grateful for that person or any person who pushes a button or is perceived as pushing a button, because they're showing me where I'm still reactive and still need to do some work. And then it's going to be more easy to turn to the reality that all problems come from my own mind. All suffering, any suffering I feel comes from my own mind. Any happiness I feel comes from my own mind. And since the thoughts within my mind are the causes of my happiness, then I can return to seeking happiness from my own mind, not from external things. So this, for me, this is an ongoing practice, and maybe for you too.